Hey everybody, it's Pooch Van Druten here along with Chris Rabold.
What is happening?
How are you guys out there? Hope you guys are staying safe in this world gone absolutely crazy mad. I think pretty soon the zombie apocalypse will be upon us. But yeah, it's been an interesting couple of weeks, and we are just trying to keep our heads above water at this point.
Totally.
And survive it. But I think we're up to episode 21, which is pretty amazing. You know, we started this, over 10 weeks ago, and we've just, I know, 10 weeks ago we started this, and
we're a tenth of the way through
it. Yes, I know. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. We're really enjoying the interaction that you guys have with us, and we appreciate you tuning in. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we have lots of fun things coming. Hopefully in the future, we'll be talking about all kinds of those things coming up. So please stay tuned. So today, what do you want to talk about, Chris?
Anything regarding audio. Any single possible thing we can that involves live audio.
Exactly. Anything but talking about the world. Yeah.
Anything about anything. Yeah.
Yes, I know.
I don't know. Let's do the thing that you and I were chatting about. Kind of more on loudness.
Okay, cool. So I've had a bunch of people ask me, both of us, I think on previous videos, we've spoken about there's nothing funner than going to a festival and having the dude look at his SPL meter and be like not believing that his SPL meter was working because the mix that you're putting out is perceived much louder than whatever the speed limit is, right? And so, both you and I have experienced that where we've shown up and, we're mixing along, and it's definitely clear that our mixes are perceived louder than maybe even the rest of the day. Like all of a sudden we show up as the headliner and we are, it's not that we're being allowed any number different than the other guys. It's that we're doing, we're doing a bunch of things to deal with perceived loudness versus measured loudness. So I thought that we might talk about that. Maybe kick us off with that in what your initial thoughts are on maybe some things that you do in order to achieve that.
Sure. A couple things spring to mind. The first place that my mind has gone is immediately it was, what does it look like at the final stage of my mix? Because I think that's what people are going to want to hear is about what we're doing there, which is vitally important. And I have things to say there that I'm very passionate about. But then the second place my brain goes, which is maybe more important, is to something that we harp on often, but there's a reason, and it is this all of the various stages leading up to the very end. Both of us, neither of us have this super loose mix that then at the end we clamp something on and it brings it all down and then it magically works.
Right. Right.
So I think, going back to something that we speak about often, it's just all of these various stages. And that's typically in grouping or in bussing or however you want to phrase it, is kind of putting the reins on the dynamic range of virtually everything in small little steps incrementally, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So I think that's a big part of it. And maybe I'll just touch on these real quick and then we can kind of circle back around
totally.
to plus whatever else you want to throw in there. But I think it's that. I think it's the pre-bake. I think it's all those little steps that go there. And then it is what you do at the very, very end. And everyone, we've talked about the $100 million question is always what's on your stereo bus, and I love the guys that say nothing. Like I love it, like nothing line. It's great, but that's not the case with me. And for a lot of us, and I can tell you what does the least is for me is actual compression. The way I use, and what I mean by that is a compressor. Now limiting is a different
Right.
story
Okay.
altogether.
Cool.
But when I think about compression for me in the stereo bus, it's usually slower attack times, quicker release. Kind of, it does put the clamps on things, but it's also used to accentuate those transients and to make it snappier and with a little more pop. So while it reins in some of the average level, the meat of stuff does get a little grip on it. It's sort of, a lot of times, you know, like if you see a meter that's doing -3, for example, that doesn't always mean you need exactly +3. In fact, you may only need +1 because you're really accentuating 2 dB of transient. You know what I'm saying?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So I think we should get into the nuts and bolts of it a little bit too, and speak to RMS versus peak and those kind of things. But first, maybe let's back up just a little bit and kind of talk about the physics and the testing that people have done in regards to perceived loudness versus measured, because this is not just something that we've made up. There's a lot of people that have done some testing on it. So when we're talking about acoustical energy, you know, the basic physical law there is that for every 3 dB, it doubles in sound pressure level. Okay. So whenever you're talking about looking at equipment or measuring something, when you see a 3 dB change, either plus or minus, it doubles the perceived loudness. Okay. But
and we'll make a point that is the acoustic response.
Yes.
That is right. That's not the voltage.
Correct.
Which
Correct.
is metering altogether, or different means of mathematics altogether.
100%. So like, you know, changing on a meter of an output bus from 0 to +3 is not doubling what's coming out of there. I'm just talking about like if you're looking at an SPL meter and you see a 3 dB change, that is a measured double amount of acoustic pressure. But actually, there's been a lot of testing, and people only start to perceive changes around 5 dB, okay? And at about 10 dB is when they perceive something has doubled. So what's interesting about that is someone that's using a meter looks at it and says a 3 dB change in the meter and goes, wow, this is double. He's doubly as loud. But in truth and in the reality of the world, a 10 dB change is really when someone starts to notice the double the amount. So the reason I wanted to point that out and in that testing is that there is vast differences between measured loudness and perceived loudness. And they're supposed to be the same, but when you test people, they aren't. And all of these things are related to a bunch of different stuff, like dynamic range. You know, I always say, like, okay, so to explain a dynamic range thing, the difference between silence and an explosion and an explosion is super vast. So silence to an explosion feels huge. An explosion to another explosion doesn't feel like there's a it doesn't have the same kind of impact, right? So when we're talking about dynamic range, and we'll travel down this rabbit hole maybe a little bit, you know, there's a perceived thing that happens with dynamic range and peak. Do you speak to that a little bit if you can? Because I know that you always talk about dynamic range and the perceivedness of that.
Yep. And it is a rabbit hole, because we're sitting here and tell you that, again, when we get into human hearing, you know, the way we perceive things, and that's where we're getting into peak level versus RMS level. RMS more closely approximates the way we hear things.
That's right. And now, don't forget about frequency too, Fletcher Munson, when we start talking about all this. So yeah, keep going.
Right. And how we perceive things is different at different frequencies. Again, look up the Fletcher Munson curve, and you're going to see why it's important to keep your, if you can, to keep your mix level at a consistent level, because you'll keep tonally, it'll stay the same. As it goes up and down in volume, that frequency response will change.
And that is a factor of human hearing. That is
Yep.
a perception that people have in relation to frequency, just so you guys know that.
Yep. And so now we're getting into essentially evolution.
We are.
But that's it, man. That's
Yeah,
really what we're talking about. So the thing that's sort of counterintuitive is that we will sit here and tell you that you can have if RMS most closely approximates human hearing.
Yes.
How we perceive loudness. So if your RMS is louder, let's say you could have a signal, you could have a mix, and where the peak is on one is here, and then the peak on this one is actually lower. But if the RMS on this one is higher than the RMS on this one will sound louder. However, that doesn't mean a gunshot, which has an enormous amount of peak level and very little RMS, won't blow your ears out.
That's right.
That's the thing. So you are still physically affected by peak level, but as far as hearing and
perception of sound pressure level,
correct,
that matters. And it's the same way as like a compressor allows you. So if you're able to take a compressor and condense the peaks down to a level, then the overall amount of that level can be raised.
Exactly.
So that is what people are doing, like in the loudness war with records. That's exactly what's happening with that. It's by reducing peak level and making your RMS be greater, the perception of it is that it's louder. Even though you're reducing level, you're reducing a peak level, the perception of it is louder because you're able to reduce the peaks and therefore turn it up a little bit in the digital scale.
Yeah, so. And here's on an input level, here's a good example. Let's say you've got a live snare drum and then you have a sample. He's got an SPD or it's on a track or something. Your live snare drum might be, if you're the kind of person where the gain structure is just sort of anywhere, it might be peaking. That sample might peak at -10. We're talking dB full scale. Might peak at -10, but sound so much louder. Because when you look at on the meter set, most peak meters now have also their version of what is essentially almost like an average or an RMS component to it as well. You'll see that super loose live snare with the peak up here. You'll see this little thing down here representing the average or the RMS.
Yes.
On that sample, you'll see the peak here and the RMS here, and it will sound so much louder. And that is such a problem nowadays in modern mixing, where those two formats are competing against one another. Is, man, I don't understand. I'm peaking, I'm clipping. My live snare is clipping, and this thing sounds so much louder, and that's it. It's just we perceive it as louder. And this right here, RMS versus peak and manipulating those things for your betterment. I mean, that's like my whole trick. And it's not anything unique to me. I know you make great use of it too. That's how we make these things. And this is also how you have mixes that aren't clipping everywhere.
That's right.
That aren't peaking everywhere, just to try to get it a place where you're not even happy with is how do you raise that RMS level?
Yeah. Let's be clear too, that this is not something that we are doing for a festival day. This is not something that we go, oh, I'm at a festival, so now I need to adjust my dynamic range so that I can beat the sound restrictions. We're doing this before that. This is part of our mix. This is what we're working on from the beginning to get our overall mix having an appearance of having loudness to it. There's a little bit of give and take here, right? Because when I spoke about dynamic range and I said that, an explosion coming from no noise to explosion, that shows you that impact comes from not RMS, impact comes from peak.
Correct.
And so you play this game of getting your RMS kind of right and getting the overall loudness so that you're able to bring it up, but not so much that you're destroying the impact part of that.
Right.
And I know you do this a little bit, but I do it a lot, which is I control the output of my console to the drive rack, and I adjust that level, sometimes 3 or 5 dB, making my own dynamics out of a mix that is nicely RMS'd, if that
Right.
makes any sense. So, for instance, if I have a verse part of a song, oftentimes I'll take the output of my console to the drive rack and turn it down 3 dB just for the verse, and on the downbeat of the chorus, I nail them with 0. And I'm kind of making my own dynamics and felt perception of dynamics, but still keeping it within the RMS dynamic range, if that makes any sense. And so those are just some tricks that I'm doing to kind of not only beat the measurement, right? Beat the 98 dBA weighted that they want me to be, and make the perception of the downbeat of the chorus be huge, but not affect the LEQ of the measurement.
Right.
But also that dynamics in general is human hearing loves to hear. We like dynamics. You know, it is the best sounding mixes to me have the right amount of dynamics that's going on in there. So that's something that I do. Is there other tricks that you kind of do to you know, not that you would do this to beat the SPL meter, but I'm just saying do things to make things have more impact, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think I'm glad you said that too, because what we don't want to do is have the message of this come across as to, vilify anything. What
just
we
turn everything into this.
You don't want the Mars bar. You don't want the
do that.
At certain points that will suck, you know. And I thought, what is your thing? Volume with impact? What is that thing you've said?
Yeah, record quality mixed with impact.
With impact. And that's the thing. Like, I've got a buddy of mine, a studio engineer, who he's told me, he's like, I'm jealous of you guys. You guys can get impact with sheer volume.
That's right.
And we can. So use that as a live sound mixer. Have a mix that you can feel. And not only feel come at you, but feel when it resends as well. That's exciting. So what we don't want to do is vilify peak level. Use peak level. Be glad we can. Because a lot of our studio brethren, man, they are kind of stuck in.
I know.
Super
I mean, honestly, that is, I would tell you 100%. I came into the live sound of this industry when the beginning of the loudness wars happened. And it was definitely on my mind that I was like, oh, good, I get to make dynamics here. Those guys don't get to anymore.
True.
So, yeah.
So, and what you were saying about, you're not just doing this to beat the meter, so to speak, and I'm not either. Like, I truly like this sound. I like, there are aspects of modern mixing that I very, very much like.
Absolutely.
When I pop in, for me, it's another level of saturation on the stereo bus. When I pop that in, man, I love the sound where the RMS goes up, and a lot of times the peak drops a little. I enjoy the sound. So we're doing it, we're building it as such, A, because we like it, and B, so that when those days show up where we are subject to metering, that our whole world's just not totally fucked, So, but I don't ride that, riding the output of the stereo bus, so to speak, or whatever, whatever the final stage is. That is a very studio thing. You'll definitely see guys that push the chorus a couple dB. That's it. I don't not believe in it. I just don't ever do it. I'll push a part. I think I've mentioned this before. I'll push I'll push a section a couple times during the show. Usually if it's just like a show that's got some like dance break track element to it to make it kind of have a club vibe.
Right.
I'll do that, but I usually don't ride mine. I kind of sit in a spot that's just I just kind of sit in this spot. I know where it is. And a lot of times, by the way that I've structured the mix via automation, the song itself might just be a little lower, So
totally get it.
I don't ride into it too much.
I do the reason that I do that. So, let me explain myself so you guys can understand. The reason that I do that is there is a different sound. So pretty much everybody has some sort of something on their mix bus that is doing a little bit of compression. In my world, it's oftentimes a C6, which means that it's multiband compression with different tonality change as you mix harder into it. So to me, there is a sound difference between trying to get that impact in an input or a group that is then affecting the master bus. In other words, so like if I wanted the downbeat of a chorus to have more impact, and if I did it on the input side, I would be mixing into the C6, and it would cause a little bit of frequency timbre change versus taking the output of my, master bus and adjusting it for full range impact.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, it's kind of the old idea of mixing into a compressor or not mixing into a compressor, and especially a multi-band compressor that changes timbre. I prefer not to mix into a compressor. I like an insert on a group, for instance, where I'm not, mixing into the compressor, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I do it. But I totally get it. You're getting impact from in a different way. We're doing the same things. You're just doing it in a different way.
Yeah. And what's cool is what's cool is something we point out a lot here is we've got so many similarities and there's things we do differently.
Totally.
While I don't turn on that stereo bus processing at the beginning of a mix, it comes really quick. And at the point that I do it, at a certain point, I am mixing into it. Again, because I spoke earlier when we started the video about wanting those transients to crawl. Like it gets to a point where I am very much leaning into it. So for me, compression on an output stage is more for not tonal. It's more for excitement. You know what I mean? Maybe this is a good way to kind of segue into some of the things that we do also at the very end, or at least that I do. While I'll use the compressor more for excitement, it's saturation, of course, and I use it everywhere before, but then I've always got something at the end. Not always. I will turn it off on occasion. People would be surprised. I've got this stereo bus chain that's been that way for a while.
Yeah.
And I will sit there and I'll turn that shit off repeatedly. And sometimes it might even be for my own sake to feel like I did something,
Like during a show, you'll insert.
Yep, because when I tell you the way that I use, like I've mentioned that the Sonic Farm Creamliner or any number of other saturation devices you can use. With it on, if I turn it off, the mix will oftentimes seem to get, and here, this is exactly what we're talking about, it will get quieter. It will get less exciting, it'll get quieter, when in fact, it's often the exact same SPL, if not a dB or two hotter, which is
right.
That's what we're talking about. But there are times by raising RMS, you are kind of shoving everything together. So that's
true.
The part. How do you, it's not as simple, guys, as just grabbing that limiter and making it do this. Like, how do you do that and everything it's not 18 elephants in an elevator. You know what I mean?
That's right.
How do you maintain the space? So there will be times when there is no SPL restrictions or anything, but I'm listening and I'm like, it's just, this room's tough. I'm having a hard time. It's cluttered. You know what? I actually want some space. So if I turn that saturation off, which is essentially just limiting with harmonic excitement, by that loosening up, which again, we can do that in live sound. So embrace it. A lot of times we'll clean the mix up. Yeah. So the things that I do are oftentimes there will be an element of saturation, again, just for the limiting, just for the harmonic excitement, mainly the way it lifts the low mids. And then it's funny, like, I'm like you, I'll have a band bus and then I'll have a vocal bus. And that's very common in live sound because with people doing processing at the very end of the chain, they don't want that band bus might be pretty heavy into active compression, meaning not really hitting peaks, like it's just kind of moving the whole time. And you don't want your vocal being pushed down by that. Again, this in live sound, truth be told, a lot of times your vocal could live in that and it would be really cool, but we need that vocal to pop up and over. We need every bit. We've talked about it before, we don't want that noise floor to raise and the vocal to be stuck down there to where you're turning it up and you're turning up all that shit that's just going to feed back and make mush. While I will do that so that my vocal a lot of times is not subject to the active compression, I'm nowadays not as afraid to put a digital plugin peak limiter on an output. And it's like, well, wait a minute, why are you just said you can't afford the 2 dB from the compression. Why can you take it there? It's because what that L2 or that name your limiter is grabbing is the fastest of fast peaks.
That's right.
That's what we're talking about. You're okay to lose that 2 dB. And not only are you okay to lose that 2 dB, when the meter comes around, you're going to need that 2 dB to be in your favor.
Yep.
Like the last thing you want is some guy to be going, you're over.
Yeah.
And you're all out of your game. And really all you're over on are little snare hits that super fast digital peak limiting grabbing will A, take care of, B, that's a sound. Like that's a sound of modern music. So I will have between the saturation and then if I'm feeling ballsy or I feel like I can, and I'll even do this with Bruno Mars, I've spoken to how lively the vocal can be there and how hot it can be. I'll even do it with him because for whatever reason, that super fast grab I can get away with. Him living in compression on the stereo bus doesn't always work. So that's kind of how I get those extra 1 up to 4 dB at the output level. And think about that. Think about the difference in 4 dB when there is a measurement there.
Oh man, I know.
That's everything. And to essentially have the same mix.
Yep.
Now, as always, there's a fine line into how much you can get away to where you start to lose the integrity of your powerful mix, and just the noise floor comes up. So there's a balance there.
Absolutely. I was thinking as you were talking, the physicality of so this that you guys might be interested in is that an RMS meter is based on a sample of the peak that is somewhere around 300 milliseconds. And this isn't just something that somebody made up. They did some research and discovered that people's perception of change is somewhere around 300 milliseconds, right? So when we're talking about a super fast limiter, we're talking about something that's working in the, 30 to 40 millisecond kind of a range, or even, faster than that. And so that's why the perception of what it's doing, it's so fast. The perception of what's happening on that bus is not that it's just squashing and clamping down. It's that, oh, wow, it's keeping this RMS level, as a pretty standard thing. So I just thought you might be interested to know that, it's not like people are just decided, oh, I need to have some sort of way to measure a normal thing without peak. This was definitely like people did a lot of research about hearing and said, okay, the perception of hearing is somewhere around 300 milliseconds. Let's make the RMS meter be somewhere from 100 to 300, so all these things are important. And why I'm telling you these things are that you can maybe have them in your toolkit here so that when you come upon a situation where you have, measured SPL versus perceived SPL, those are things that you can, those are things you can grab from your toolkit and be like, okay, so if I use L2, it's a super quick limiter. It might help me, with the output side of that. So that's kind of why I'm sharing that.
Yep. And, you can drive yourself crazy / really illuminate your mind when you start going into ballistics timing. When you go in to look at what you were mentioning, like what's the speed of a VU meter,
right?
First peak meter, then get into the peak meters in general. Like if you open up, we often reference Digico. I see one there in the background.
Yes.
I think their stock. Yeah, there's.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm at the Tater Audio World Headquarters here this week. I drove up from Dallas to Detroit, and that's probably what you're hearing. All kinds of motorcycles drive by and all kinds of shit. I live out in the middle of nowhere, but this is near downtown Detroit, so you're getting all the sounds of the city and the.
Some of it really kind of fit in well to this. And keep you above the average bullshit level, which that's actually makes for a great point too. Because now that I think, I don't even remember what I was getting ready to say. One of the things that's so tough with live mixing as well is signal to noise. And in that, I used to, an empty room sucks. An empty room is difficult. It's not going to sound like that at showtime. There's more reflections. But the longer I've gone in my career, actually, a lot of times I will like the sound of the empty room during the day, because even though it'll have greater reflections, the number of perceived reflections, because they are simply greater without all the bodies there to soak them up. Sometimes during the day, I can really hear it. There's a much greater level of overall signal to noise. Because when the crowd gets in there and all that chatter and all that movement, next thing you know, and this is another reason to have a mix that's really strong in RMS, because if like here's the musicality, here's the bulk of your signal. If it's sitting way down here and all of a sudden the crowd gets in there and they're hanging out here, that's why you're like, what the fuck? And this is where you get in trouble. Then you start pushing that mix. Now your peak is growing. Suddenly you're at 106 because you're trying to get that shit above the rumble, above just the noise. And so my point of that is a lot of times I can hear the lower level detail in an empty room.
Yeah.
And once comes showtime, it might be a little tighter, but I'm just like, oh man, because now I'm mixing, particularly like we talk about Justin Bieber, or these people that are out mixing, you know, I don't know, One Direction or BTS or whatever the hell the screaming thing is. Man, they're mixing within there's that much to work with. So there again, there's another reason to have your RMS grader. Is we're just trying to keep, again, think about just a minute ago, a motorcycle or a truck or tank, which very well could be happening at the time of this taping, just drove by you. And it's like, we're trying to hear you within that. So that's another reason to have that RMS grader, is because it's not us in a car. It's not us in the studio. It's us with X thousand people screaming, you know?
Yeah.
So
that's a really great point. And so this speaks to also what we have talked about in our last 20 videos about clarity in your own mix. So bringing unwanted things and cluttering up your mix in general causes the overall perceived RMS of all of this to be not good. So the less things that you can cut out of your mix, that's why high pass filters are so important. Low pass filters are so important. The less things you can cut out of your mix, the more the perceived SPL will be greater, but also the overall, you know, we talk about intelligibility and clarity all the time. Those are the two things that both Chris and I want to be known for. We want people to come to our shows and be like, man, I could hear the guitar through the entire show, and the vocal was, I mean, everything. I could pick out every little detail. The reason that we do that is for the intelligibility and the clarity, but it is also how we achieve a higher perceived volume, right?
Yep, absolutely. And you know, the further I go in my career, the whole notion of like, we'll just tuck that in the mix is further bullshit, because you and I both know if there's something that is now tucked, it's still a part of the whole. So it comes to this point where you don't hear it, it just becomes a part of the muck, and it adds to the real key here though is not duck it or don't duck it, is how much say do you have in the arrangement? And a lot of times you might not have any. You know, if you've been there long enough, or you've got an open-minded group of folks you're working with, you may be able to go like, you know what, I don't think we need to tuck that. I think we need to cut that altogether. But
great. That's a great example. Great example.
You know, and that kind of goes into, particularly when we're getting into things like tracks. It's like, well, no, just tuck it. Just tuck. Let's just have it in there. And it's like, it's not doing anything.
It's not doing anything but cluttering. Yes, I know.
Right. You know, but then there's sometimes, now here's the truth of it. Here's the deal. Let's say you're mixing like a country actor like Bruce Springsteen or Timberlake, where there's 13 people on stage, and the third trumpet player needs to be doing something, but there's no horn, so they give him an acoustic, and it's like, you could probably get rid of that. You know what I'm saying? As long as everyone's on the same page, but sometimes you can't. So sometimes in live sound, we are up against the wall because there are just that number of people in the band. They want everybody to be on the stage at the same time. You know, so it gets tough. So anyway, that's kind of circling around. But
but I mean that's a very important point that we've brought up in a video in the past. If there are an instrument playing the same part in playback and a live guy playing the same part on the same instrument, that's never going to end well. So the discussion I always have with a musical director, and he may tell me to go eat it, dude. We're not doing any changes, but at least I tried. Sure. But on a lot of times they do listen to you, and you say, listen, one of them's got to go. If the guy's going to play it and he plays it well, perfect. Let's do that. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't need to be doubled in the playback. And so I have literally in the past gone all the way back to the engineer and the record company of the record who made the stems, or some assistant that made the stems, and make them remove it from that stem if I don't have access to be able to do that. It's that important, guys. It really is. If you're working in rehearsals and you have a stem where there's something stuck in it and the musical director says, well, I want the live guy to play it, don't just go, okay, well, I guess they're both going to play it. At least make the effort to go back. You know, I used to go back to Linkin Park all the time and go back to Ethan Mates, their engineer, and say, sorry, dude, can you go back 6 records and look at this stem? I need this stem to be different. And he would. And the end result of that was 100 times better than both the guitar player playing and the guitar in the stem.
Right. Right. So again, I guess the whole point of this is, you know, just be ever mindful of everything that's in there, particularly as we are squashing it and raising it to make that competitive RMS level. Cause there's a lot that goes into that, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Part of something that you guys should maybe think about too is, you know, we talked about Fletcher Munson and how our ears perceive different frequencies differently. All right. So a human ear in general perceives the most changes in the mid-range, right? So that's why when you look at a Fletcher Munson curve and the way SPLs, where it changes in the low end and kind of the high end always kind of just stays the same. Anything above 6K, pretty much your ear doesn't care what SPL that is, you know, but that 6K to, I don't know what the specs are, but let's say 100 or something, you know, average. That is the stuff that you should be focused on when you're trying to compete measured loudness versus perceived loudness, because that's the stuff that gets perceived. So actually, this is a little bit weird, guys, but actually adding mid-range a little bit in your mix will give the perception that your mix is louder, right? So if I am super struggling on a PA system that I'm not normally using and I show up at a festival, you know, I will actually use the C6 on my output bus and take the mid-range section of that C6 and raise it a little bit. Now I'm talking about like 0.5. I'm not talking about 3 dB change. I'm talking about just a barely perceived change in my mid-range. And believe it or not, it will help the perception of the overall mix, and it won't affect the measurement, because what they're measuring, even though they're measuring LEQ, they're still measuring peaks, right? So if you take a whole section of frequency range and bring it up just by 0.5, the perception of it becomes a little bit louder, but the measure doesn't. So that's one other kind of trick that I do every once in a while. That's not something I do all the time. That is literally, I've pulled all the tricks out of my rabbit hat, and or all out of my hat. I don't have any more rabbits. Let's try that and see if we can get a you know, I mean, I've been in a place recently, I think, and it was some crazy like 94 dBA weighted over like 10 minutes or something. Just a really, really hard restriction with a rock band. And so I was trying every way to beat it, and I think I used that as a tool, and it kind of helped. Do you have any other ones of those? Any of those?
No, we've talked about this before, but I think it's important to repeat, and I'm sure we'll repeat it again. It's just this very tactic is, you know, let's say, you know, and I talk a lot about tuning and specifically target curves and these sorts of things. A lot of times my target curve is for linearity, but then I will make cuts, particularly in that high mid portion that you mentioned, where the ear is most sensitive, particularly at certain SPLs, or at all SPLs, the sensitivity changes, but where we mix. So I'll have this PA that's tuned very linear, but then go in and I'll make these cuts just by ear. If I go back and measure again, it will probably look like the inverse of the Fletcher Munson curve. In other words, there's all this like 2 and 2.5 and 3 that I've pulled out because they're coming out at me a little much. Now, if I do that on an everyday basis, and then we get in an environment where there is an SPL limit, like you said. That now, we're not saying we walk into any scenario and at 92 dBA we're crushing. We're saying
exactly. No, we are not saying
and
that.
if it's 100,
Yeah.
we'll be okay. You know what I mean? But yes, when you get into those, like I remember the Greek Theater in which is an outdoor venue in Berkeley. It's notorious. That's that concrete. It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, but it's a hard place to do a show at.
Notoriously difficult. And it's like 94 dBA over however many minutes. So let's say you go in there, and every day, just about every day, you put the PA up, your systems engineer puts it up, and you notice you've always got a couple cuts and high mids. Those are, to your point, when you get in there, suddenly it's really low, put that stuff back because you're going to need it,
Absolutely,
so,
yeah.
I'll for sure do that.
But
I was going to say, this is also, so real quick, I'll say it's the same thing as if you'll notice if you usually mix at 100 and whatever, 100, 102, 104, whatever it is. Notice when you put house music on and it's way, way, way lower, how imbalanced it sounds.
That's right.
Like, even if you're not playing some heavy hip hop song, it's like all sub and you're kind of like, what? That's Fletcher Munson. That's our hearing is not the same. As it rises in level, it flattens out. So it stands to reason when you drop the volume, suddenly you're going to want to add some of this back in, and you're not really adding so much amplitude. An increased frequency level is going to provide a bit of an amplitude difference, but +2 at 3K is not the same as +2 on the output, but it'll work in your favor. Does that make sense?
Totally does. What I was going to say though, guys, is make sure that you truly understand these are like last resort stuff that we're doing to our mixes. This is not I'm showing up at every festival and this is what I do. I add some low end and add some mid range and do that. I almost 98% of the time, my mix is my mix, whether it's a festival or whether it's, somewhere else. And the reason we're telling you all of these things that are just little tips and tricks that you can try when you're struggling and having a horrible day, you should realize that we are way before this time period. We are getting all of our frequencies in our mix in such a way that at our normal listening volume, whatever that is, 102 dBA weighted tends to be where I kind of mix around it for a house, about 102. There's peaks of 104 and 5 in there, but there's also some 98 and some 97 dBA weighted LEQ. We have spent a bunch of time with our mixes that at whatever the normal volume that we listen to, let's say it's 102 for me, everything feels right? There's nothing poking out. There's none of that kind of weird frequency issues. And what happens when you get it right, your perception at lower volumes will actually make the mix feel bigger. And so this is something that we're working on over time. This isn't something that we're making changes on the day at a festival, but we do every once in a while do the things that we were just talking about.
Sure.
So I just wanted to point out that this isn't something, it's not on my mind to show up at a festival and be like, oh, it's 96 dB here. I'm going to have to turn up my low end in my mix, or I'm going to have
But it's in our arsenal of available tools go.
That's right.
All right. I know what I might have to do today,
Yes.
So,
and
there's a lot.
The combination of all of those tools is what makes you a badass, and you turn into the guy that everyone looks at you and goes, why does his mix sound so much bigger? It's all of these culmination of all of the things that we've been talking about.
Yep. There's a lot of offshoot conversations from this as well. One of which that I'm thinking of is as we're talking about, it's building a mix that's appropriately loud, competitively loud, yet not this thing that's clipping all the time. So we're talking about how to do this as it relates to both SPL measurements mainly, because we are in the live sound world and those are often a thing and are becoming more and more of a thing. But it also just goes back to how do you make a good mix? And one that's loud, it's not clipping all the time. And then another conversation that this is making me think of, and it's when we were talking about kind of adding some of that high mid stuff back in at lower levels, is really just on a mix level. A lot of times think about, if I can just take this brief aside,
Sure.
think about like when you've got a dense mix. I know everyone loves to say, not everyone loves to say, a lot of people like to say like, oh, I barely had any EQ on it. I barely used any EQ. I love saying that too. That's great. But sometimes if I've got a keyboard, sometimes, and it's just not doing it for me, guess what? Sometimes I don't need to turn it up 3 dB, which remember is not just turning that up 3 dB, it's turning the whole, it's doing something within the mix. It's not turning the whole mix up 3 dB, but it's contributing to the whole of the mix. Where I'm going with this is sometimes just go looking for a frequency. And I've embraced this a lot more lately than I did in the past. Like I'm not afraid to go to some ridiculous, seemingly ridiculous frequency on an input and boost 900 on a piano because it made it stick out. Because what that contributes to the overall mix is like who cares dB versus if I pushed it up 3, it's louder, but I brought all that other stuff I didn't need. So think about shaping your mix, and sometimes just go for frequencies. I was driving somewhere yesterday with my daughter and there was some pop song on, and every time the chorus came on, I thought to myself, of course I can't share this with a 6-year-old, but I thought this to myself. I'm like, half of what I'm hearing right now is a plus 12 boost at 16K. Yes. You know what I mean? Like what made that chorus sound so airy and neat was the boost of the HF. Had they have just turned the whole thing up,
yep,
it wouldn't do the same thing.
Wouldn't do the same thing. Yeah. I'm glad that we're having all kinds of issues today. I'm glad that you said that because that is exactly, I think about that same stuff. I tell people all the time, like, if don't get into poking around into soloing up some of my inputs.
Oh, no.
Because some of my inputs by themselves are a little bit like, why does that piano have 900 in it? Wow, it's got a ton of it. Well, Don't listen to it there. Listen to it in the overall picture of what's going on, because I do the same exact thing. Sometimes I'll make an instrument that would soloed up by itself is not all that much pretty. But in the scope of the mix, it pokes through enough that it is a thing, you know? Yep. So yeah, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, I mean, this is all, SPL is truly getting the perceived loudness of SPL. Really what we're talking about is how do you make your mix be better is really the deal, right? Sure. Like a better mix will then be perceived loudness, will be perceived as louder than other people's mixes. I think one thing that is at the forefront of the way that I think when I'm building a mix is frequency sharing space. I think we talked about this a little bit, but if you can get your mix to kind of be in a situation where all frequencies are being represented by different things, and there's not peak areas of all of your frequencies, if all of those frequencies are represented, the perception of your mix's loudness will be much louder, as opposed to frequencies kind of all being representative, but there would be a big scoop at 200, let's say.
Right.
In regards to looking at it like it's smart, right? You look at it and you go, oh man, there's a big scoop at 200. It feels like there's some 200 missing. That mix versus somebody that has their shit together where all frequencies are kind of being equally represented and RMS'd, for lack of a better term, sure, in frequency way, the overall perception of the entire mix is perceived as louder. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And this is making me think of things like in the middle of the show. And again, this goes into, Pooch and I talk a lot about, we have these tried and true methods. And then if those don't work, we have these other things. At the end of the day, we're doing live sound like you guys.
It's combat audio, man. It's combat.
It absolutely 100% is, and I'm sitting here thinking about, I very rarely, and I think it's a good practice to have, as much as I'm into sort of exercises for critical listening or like having marks to hit, I rarely have ever dug into what my favorite mixes look like via an RTA, because
yeah, right.
I don't know, but I think it's a good practice, and I think there could be a lot of validity to it. But I don't know. I've never really gotten into that because it all depends on what the music is and what matters.
Totally.
But you will notice, let's say you've got that screen up. Of course, we talk a lot about not watching smart and like just being slave to it. But if you've got that screen up off to the side and you see the RTA, a lot of time, or whatever you're using for that sort of measurement, a lot of times you'll see, particularly in tall U.S. arenas, but in any tall venue, you get all that 400 to 800 that like lives in the roof. And it doesn't matter how great your prediction software is and how accurate the PA is focused. There's something just lives up there. And you'll watch on the RTA, you'll see every time a vocalist goes in, you'll see like this 600 thing. And that's not in your mix.
Right.
That's in the room. And while you can't EQ the room, you can EQ the system.
For sure.
Sometimes though, you do just go, shit, every time that person who I know's vocal is as good as it could be. I know it's as smooth as it could be, but in this room, it's setting off 400 to 800. Maybe you make a little thing there. And again, as it goes into SPL, because that too will contribute to an SPL measurement. You know, sometimes rooms just are set up, not sometimes, all the time, rooms are set off at different places. And that too will factor into, again, if there's a measurement. And even if there's not a measurement, it might just be an unpleasant sound. You know?
For sure. For sure. I'm speaking to trying to get our listeners
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
To have a tool. So, you know, I'm like Chris. I don't spend all my time looking at smart and being like, oh, you know, I got a little something there I got to work on. However, when you're learning how to get perceived loudness by looking at the output of your console, not the mic, by looking at the output of your console in smart, if you can achieve a more balanced frequency-wise mix, it will help you to achieve the perception of loudness. Is kind of, so I'm trying to give you guys a tool, like start there, but then quit looking at smart and use your ears. I mean, you know, but that's a place that you could look at and check out. You will notice also in that, go take smart and look at what your favorite records are going on. There are a lot of records that are not that are like super pokey at 2K or super pokey at 250. Kind of more modern records are along the lines of what I'm talking about, using equally the kind of frequencies that we're talking about. But you know, certainly like in the 80s and 90s, there, you know, if you looked at a record that was made then and looked at smart, you would discover that it is not that. It's not like linear, you know. There's a lot of more pokey parts. And don't get me wrong, I don't want your mixes to be completely linear. You know, where we get impact and where we get emotion from and where we get I don't know what the word is, but the feeling of music, let's say, is by something that is not super squashed and not super linear. You know what I mean? You need all those things in order to have something sound musical. So all of these things we are suggesting to you in order to raise the perception of volume, you need to use sparingly.
Yep. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, something that I'll often do is, I mentioned I'll touch on the best of days, I don't touch the stereo bus stuff. And for me, it's hardware, so it's right there. Or if it's in the box, it's simple and get to it real easy. Something I do most of the times, even if I'm, let's say I've got cans on or near fields, and I'm finding I'm liking a more squashed mix in general. And in this situation, I am talking about via the compressor. That aside from putting that transient through, I want it held back. Or sometimes I will go, like I'm usually like a 30 or 10 millisecond kind of guy on like a traditional VCA bus comp. Sometimes I like the sound of like 3 and 1. I mean, that's kind of cool and grabby too. A lot of times I'll convince myself that's what I want. Then once the show gets going, that threshold starts going higher and higher. The attack goes back to where it always is, which is 10 or 30. And I've got the needle doing like this. Yep. It's like half a dB or 1.
Just tickling.
Just tickling. And then the output though comes down because that's that excitement, that movement, that feeling. I remember having back-to-back nights with Lady Gaga at the Staples Center years ago. And it'd been one of those tours where it was just super dialed in, and everywhere we went was high fives, and it was just,
Right.
great. Everything was great. We got into the Staples Center on the first night, and it's not the first time I've been in there, and it just sucked, man. It just wasn't fun.
Huh.
And I kind of left sort of dejected. And the next night I came in, the only thing I did is I went to did exactly what I just said.
Wow.
I just loosened up that stereo bus comp, and it just moved just enough.
Came alive.
More.
Yeah.
And it came alive. And that's all I did. We didn't touch the system. We would do one thing, and it was night and day different, So I found myself,
it's amazing that you say that. It's once you get to a place where the littlest of changes are huge things, that is an indicator that you got it right. Like if you got going on where if you grab your compressor on your mix bus and adjust it by just, two things, and all of a sudden there's a drastic change that happens, that kind of means that I've got this, handled. I got this ringed in. So,
Yep.
Cool.
For sure.
We're kind of coming to the end. What do you have anything else you want to address on this topic? I mean, I think we have maybe given the guys a lot of tools to get some perceived loudness versus measured.
And I would say, as always, just experiment, with your club or your tour or your church or your whatever you're doing at home now. See what this stuff sounds like.
Yeah.
Then when you're able to go back into the wild, put it into practice. And I talk about not being afraid to put that peak limiting on there. Well, try it, because there is a point where you do need to be afraid, see
Totally.
where you can take it and what you can and can't get away with, and develop your own style for this.
Totally. The one thing after I just said, hey, is there anything else we should be talking about? I thought one more thing that we should talk about is LUFS. We should talk about broadcast in the same place that perceived volume is in regards to the acoustical perceived volume. Nowadays, everybody's mixing to broadcast, right? So we're using, a lot of guys are using meters, loudness meters these days, to stay within the parameters of whatever the social media thing is, So generally, a LUFS measurement, well, I don't know. Tell them a little bit what LUFS is, and then we'll speak about what the measurement numbers are.
Yeah. So LUFS came around as a result of proposed and eventually instigated legislation. And I believe it began in Europe, where it's the whole thing of you're sitting there, you're watching TV, and then Crazy Larry's ad comes on, and it's 30 times louder, and you're all chasing it. So they wanted to do something about that. So the broadcast entities developed, and they all have their own standards. And it stands for loudness units, full scale. And so essentially what they were doing with those ads is, TV or whoever, or even if it was a broadcast mix thing, they were staying within a level that may have been loud, but they allowed for some dynamics to retain some sort of audio character and care. Crazy Larry's couch sale doesn't give a shit. And
he doesn't.
God damn, we're breaking the his or her, that thing was, there was no variance between RMS and peak. It was full bore, baby. So it would come in to be super loud. So they said, look, you've got to stay here. And it's very similar. It's just, it's measured different. And I won't go into the mathematics of it, but it's similar to, you can look at it like LUFS, a negative 10 LUFS and a negative 10 RMS is not the same thing. Right. The mathematics is different. That's what it was created for. Apple, Spotify, YouTube, everybody has their own. So in fact, if you go in with some screaming loud signal, if it's above their standard, if their standard is -7 or whatever, if you go in there and it's above it, not only have you not just like whipped everybody like you thought you're going to be turned down. You're actually going to be lower. So I can say this, I've always checked my RMS and my peak as I'm building mixes, particularly as I did more and more where my mixes were going to broadcast. LUFS is not new, but it's means way more now than it ever did. When next big tour I build, it's going to lean more heavily on LUFS measurements.
And
you know?
yeah, and I think more and more people will maybe have that loudness meter on their, the broadcast or the record bus just to
Yes.
kind of see what's happening. So RMS, the difference between RMS and LUFS, as I perceive it, is that an average RMS is somewhere around 300 milliseconds. It's taking samples of information, whereas LUFS is more like LEQ for SPL measurement in that it is over the entire time of when you start the thing. So say you can instantiate the LUFS plugin, it starts working, it will continue to make an average of that over time. So it could be even 30 minutes worth of averaging that meter is coming up with the total amount. So you'll often see in a LUFS meter, it'll show you peak information of where you're at all the time, which is more kind of an RMS meter. And then the LUFS averaging, which is kind of like what LEQ is for SPL, but looking at the bus that's doing that. So I kind of just wanted to bring that up just because we live in this world now where we're doing all this broadcast stuff. I too am not the guy that was using LUFS metering before, but I think now that I've been doing a lot of streaming and certainly posting a lot of stuff like this, every social media thing has their own what they want you to be at. Like YouTube for some reason is at -16. The rest of the world is pretty much at -14. So it just depends. It's like you have to look at whatever those things are and work towards that. In that world, I now know that I'm going to have to start looking at more and more at a LUFS meter for the stuff that I'm shipping to a broadcast guy or away from me. So,
And something important is just, LUFS, even though it 100% pertains to streaming and broadcast, it is becoming a critical part of just the verbiage of
Totally.
mixing.
Yep.
So where you have someone like myself or you, we're referring to RMS. Pretty soon that language is going to change to where people are going to be talking about LUFS, even if their mix never goes anywhere near a broadcast or a streaming site.
Yep.
So just learn it because it's where we're headed, and it's a measurement that's going to matter.
Yep.
It does matter.
Yeah. And also the interesting thing, I was doing this the other day, which is interesting. I was streaming, or I was going to stream to that Live Sound Summit thing. And so I was looking at a LUFS meter to kind of, just see what I was going to be streaming, broadcasting out. And it was telling me a lot about what was happening with my peaks in my mix. It was very telling looking at a peak meter that's on a LUFS thing and then seeing what the result of that measurement was. It was kind of actually helpful for me to see what was happening dynamically in my mix, which I had not experienced before. Just using it as a tool, as looking at it and being like, oh, wow, yeah, that section does have a lot of peak information in it. That I may not have noticed without looking at a LUFS meter. So anyway, it's something that we're definitely going to be, using more and more, and it'll definitely be part of the verbiage. So, all right, Chris. Well, thanks a lot for I learned a lot today. That was a lot of fun. It was.
Nice escape. I say that every time, but that was a good escape.
No, it was a good escape. Thanks for showing up, guys. Make sure that you tell all your friends, come subscribe, subscribe to our social media, and we'll keep doing them. All right. Thanks for showing up, guys. See ya.
See you, everybody.